Olá, bom dia a todas, bom dia a todos. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to start this webinar. And well, following the tension in Brazil's electoral process in October 2022, we look relieved at the midterm elections in the US in November. As in Brazil, democracy was at stake there. Maybe under a more significant threat, since unlike Brazil, there are many possibilities of retrenching voting rights by state authorities under the US federal system. How should the election results be interpreted from a legal institutional perspective? Can we say that the issue of abortion and women's participation in elections has offset the gerrymandering done in the previous months? What are the prospects of this system? Can we say that the institutions have emerged strengthened? To help Brazilians understand these issues, I have the pleasure of receiving at the University of São Paulo Law School two experts on US electoral law, or, as I learned in medicine from Professor Yablon, the law of democracy. I begin by thanking Professor Daniel Toquegi and Professor Robert Yablon for accepting my invitation to talk about American elections to a Brazilian audience. I also thank Professor Eneida Desirée Salgado from the Federal University of Paraná for commenting on our American colleagues' speech and helping build bridges in understanding US electoral law by Brazilian students and faculty. I briefly introduce our guests. Professor Daniel Toquegi is the Fred and Vi Miller Professor and Dean at the University of Wisconsin Law School at Madison. He is a leading authority in election law, addressing voting rights, free speech, and democratic inclusion. He has published many articles and books on the topic, including election law, democracy, and legal education, and gerrymandering and association. He also authored some course books, such as Election Law in a Nutshell, and co-authored Election Law Cases and Materials, which is in its 7th edition. His recent scholarship also addresses the role of law schools in strengthening democratic governance. Professor Robert Yablon is an associate professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. He is also the co-director of the State Democracy Research Initiative, created at Wisconsin University to foster academic research on state-level democracy, government institutions, and public law, serving as a resource for academics, policymakers, and advocates across the USA. Professor Eneida Desirée Salgado is a constitutional law and electoral law professor at the Federal University of Paraná Law School. In 2020, she was a visiting professor at the University of California, Irvine, at the Center for the Study of Democracy, where she studied electoral behavior and elections. She also created the Politics by for Women group to study women's participation policies and to boost more women in politics. In the Brazilian October 2022 elections, she ran for the Senate, where she got real experience in electoral law. So thank you all, and thanks for the students and professors that follow our webinar on YouTube. Professor Toquegi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. It is a wonderful honor to be speaking with you all today, to be joining my distinguished colleague, Professor Yablon, and to have the opportunity for conversation with Professor Salgado as well. I'm really looking forward to it. As I look outside my window here in beautiful Madison, Wisconsin, I see snow all over the ground, frost on the trees. And at this moment, I'm very much wishing I was down in Brazil with you all, where I'm sure the weather looks quite different. But that will have to wait for another time. It is a real privilege to talk to people, a group of people who I know, because you're participating today, care so much about democracy, as all of us who are participating in this webinar do. What I'm going to do with my remarks is to share some thoughts first on the background of elections and election administration in the United States, to talk about some of the big issues that have emerged, especially over the past 20 years or so, a time in which there has been heightened attention since the Bush versus Gore election of 2000 to our election system, and in which we've seen a great deal of changes, many of them positive. And then to talk about some of the things that happened in the 2020 election and some of the activity, including litigation, in the 2022 election. Professor Yablon will then take the floor and talk about some other issues having to do with 2022 and beyond, including the way in which legislative district lines are drawn in the United States and the persistent problem of gerrymandering. So let me begin by sharing my screen with you all, if I might, and hopefully you will now be able to see my opening screen, where you see on the right-hand side a photo of the crowd that was gathered outside of the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. The day that the electoral votes were to be counted in Congress, electoral votes that came out with our now President Joe Biden having a majority, that ultimately happened. Those votes were counted, but not until a mob violently stormed the United States Capitol. This was a real wake-up call for many American voters and politicians. I think those of us who study elections and democracy, people like Professor Yablon and I, have been aware that there were some simmering problems in our democracy, problems that had been simmering for years, and we'll have an opportunity, I hope, to talk about some of them here. But this was an event that captured the public's consciousness and drew attention to those issues in a way that hadn't been the case before. And in the 2 years since then, we've seen the persistence of what has come to be known as election denialism in the United States. People, adherents of our former president, Donald Trump, who deny the result of the 2020 election, insisting incorrectly that those results were tainted by rampant voting fraud, and who have refused to accept the result. And this is a real problem for any democracy, because a democracy ultimately depends on our shared willingness to accept the results of elections as legitimate, even if they were not the results that we would have preferred. And so I do think that we have been in a really difficult, challenging period for American democracy that came to a head on January 6, 2021. We can talk about how the 2022 elections that just took place last week changed that picture, but we are certainly not out of the woods in the United States. So here's what I plan to discuss in the remainder of my remarks before turning the floor over to Professor Yablon. First, I'll give an overview of the US election system and some of the developments over the last 20 years or so. We'll talk a bit about the 2020 presidential election, and then we'll talk about some of the developments that took place this past year. So in terms of an overview of the US election system, I think for those who are not terribly familiar with our system, and especially those who are coming from another country, there are three things that are particularly important to be aware of. Three things that are quite distinctive about US elections. The first is that our system, compared to most other countries, is extraordinarily decentralized, with most authority lodged in our 50 states and thousands of local government entities. Here in the state of Wisconsin alone, we have 1,850 municipalities that are responsible for administering elections at the local level. We have an exceptionally decentralized system. The way I often describe it to people who are not familiar with this model is that election law and the administration of elections in the United States is primarily a matter of state law and local practice. Most of the laws that govern the way that elections are conducted, including federal elections, comes from the states, from state legislatures and state administrative authorities. And then in terms of what actually happens, there is often variation within the state to the county or even the municipal, that is the city or village level. This is different from most other countries in which there are generally national election authorities that have much greater control over how elections are run. The second distinctive aspect of the United States election system is partisanship. Administration of the elections in the United States is partisan. And let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean is that most states have an elected chief election official. That is someone who is elected to office, who is the nominee of one or the other of our two major political parties. We, of course, have a strong two-party system in the United States and have since our inception. Most of our chief election officials in the United States, and it's generally the Secretary of State in most of the 50 states, they're elected. So they are nominated by their party through a primary, and then they appear on the ballot with either a D or an R next to their name. This creates, I think, an inherent conflict of interest between, on the one hand, their duty to discharge their responsibilities as election officials impartially, and on the other, their loyalty to their party, often their desire for re-election or election to a higher office, which gives them an incentive to make decisions favoring their own party. So most states have an elected chief election official. A minority, including our state, Wisconsin, have a bipartisan board, which I think to be a better model than the one that is dominant throughout the United States. The third distinctive but quite important aspect of our election system is that at the very top of all this is a layer of federal laws, right? I said that election administration is mostly a function of state law and local practice, but there are some important laws that govern our elections. There's the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits race discrimination in voting, and there is the United States Constitution. And without giving a detailed history lesson, I want to talk a bit about the constitutional right to vote, as well as the Voting Rights Act. It has long been said that, as you see on the screen, the political franchise of voting is regarded as a fundamental political right, because it is preservative of all rights. In other words, none of our rights are safe unless we're able to vote. Now, the right to vote is actually not expressly protected as a general matter in the United States. There's no clause of the Constitution, for example, saying that all citizens shall have the right to vote. But there is a provision of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, italicized at the bottom of this slide, which has been understood to implicitly confer a right to vote. This is the primary font as a matter of US constitutional law of the right to vote, which again has been implied into our Constitution since the late 1800s. The 14th Amendment, of course, is one of the amendments that was adopted after the United States Civil War that had the effect of ending slavery in this country. Another amendment adopted at that period of time, 2 years later, the 15th Amendment, expressly prohibits racial discrimination with respect to voting. But the proverbial ink on the 15th Amendment was barely dry when throughout the states of the former Confederacy, the states where slavery had been legal, we saw the mass disenfranchisement of African Americans. This is a chart showing the number of African Americans serving in state legislatures first between 1868 and 1900. And you see there were over 300 as of 1872. That number was down to 0 by 1900. And that was the result of a deliberate campaign of disenfranchising African Americans. And here we see the words of one governor from one of the states of the former Confederacy, Charles Aycock, who is quite explicit about his desire to disenfranchise African Americans, that is, to exclude them from the right to vote, notwithstanding the fact that the Supreme Court had by then declared the right to vote fundamental and that the 15th Amendment expressly prohibited race discrimination in voting. And, you know, that's pretty much where things stood from 1900 until the 1960s. Through most of the southern states, African Americans were kept from voting. And it wasn't really until the enactment of the Voting Rights Act that that right, which had been part of our Constitution by that time for almost 100 years, really became a reality. That dismantled the barriers to voting that had existed in the South before 1965 and resulted in the full enfranchisement, at least practically full enfranchisement of African Americans, although there remained continuing barriers to full equality with respect to political representation. I'm going to fast forward now to what's happened over the past 20 years in the United States, and in particular to the aftermath of the 2000 election between then Governor George W. Bush and then Vice President Al Gore. It was a very close election that came down to one state, the state of Florida, and hinged on these punch card ballots that we used in the United States. I have an old punch card machine on my wall there, back there behind me. These produce a lot of ambiguously marked ballots, and those ballots turned out to be dispositive in the 2000 election. The Supreme Court wound up intervening, saying that there were inequalities in how those votes were being counted in the state of Florida. The result of that was that the recounting of votes stopped. With Bush still ahead by a few hundred votes, he became our president and, of course, served for the next 8 years as the United States president. Now, whether or not one agrees with this decision, one of the positive aspects of what happened in 2000 is that we started to pay a whole lot more attention to our election system and our electoral infrastructure. And we saw in the years after Bush versus Gore significant changes to U.S. elections, including the replacement of antiquated voting equipment, the adoption of statewide registration lists, and the adoption of provisional voting, that is, ballots that were made available to people who didn't have requisite identification or whose names weren't on registration lists when they came in to vote, a problem that we learned after the 2000 election was responsible for the loss of literally millions of votes. Congress acted 2 years later with a bipartisan bill, a genuinely bipartisan bill supported by Democrats and Republicans, the Help America Vote Act. Many states changed their voting rules as well. Some liberalized their rules, for example, made it easier to vote absentee before Election Day. Other states adopted stricter rules, such as laws that require government-issued photo identification in order to vote, a form of identification that many Americans, it might surprise you to hear, don't have. I know that national ID cards are prevalent in many other countries, but not in the United States. The most common form of photo identification in the United States is a driver's license, but if you can't afford a car, if you mainly rely on public transportation, you may not have that form of ID. The debate over these kinds of changes has often been partisan, with Democrats tending to emphasize greater access, favoring the liberalization of voting laws to make it easier to vote, Republicans tending to advocate security, arguing for stricter measures to make sure there's no cheating in elections. So the 2020 election was really extraordinary in lots of ways. Of course, it took place in the middle of a pandemic, and yet we saw record turnout with some 160 million people voting, more than 2/3 of eligible citizens, which is our highest turnout since 1904. There was also this massive shift from in-person to mail voting, going from 21% voting remotely to almost half of voters choosing to vote remotely via mail. This is an article by a prominent law professor and political scientists, Nate Persley and Charles Stewart, the miracle and tragedy of the 2020 US election. And I think it's really true. It was a fantastic election in some ways that we managed this enormous shift from in-person voting to mail voting in 2020 and did it in a relatively seamless way with more people voting than had voted in over 100 years. That's the miracle. The tragedy is that despite what a well-run election it was, a substantial segment of the population, especially Republicans, did not see it that way. And to this day, a substantial percentage of Republicans believe that Trump was the true winner and that the result of the 2020 election was fraudulent. That is not true, but it is something that many people in the United States continue to believe. There are lots of lawsuits in every election year. And I want to be very clear. I don't think these election lawsuits are really what's causing the problem. But we saw a lot of them in 2020. You see on this graph put together my co-author, Rick Hasson, we saw a pretty significant increase in election lawsuits around the time of the 2000 election that I mentioned earlier. Then even more in 2004, a few years later. But 2020 set an even higher bar for how many election lawsuits there were. We saw some 424 by Professor Hasson's count in 2020. To give an overview of this litigation, a lot of it was in response to the pandemic. Some states sought to make it easier to vote, to liberalize their voting rules. In other places, you saw lawsuits that challenged the liberalization of voting rules. We saw lawsuits that were filed both before and after Election Day in 2020. Here's the big thing that was different. Litigation challenging the result of the presidential election based on alleged fraud or other misconduct that was supported by our then President Donald J. Trump and his allies. And this really resulted in a massive loss of confidence in the election, the persistent false claims by President Trump and his allies that he really won. What's really important to note is that our judicial system actually held up quite well to this onslaught. Out of 73 post-election lawsuits that were brought by Trump and his allies, only 2 were successful, and those on relatively small issues. You can get away with making false claims of election fraud in the public forum, and in our hyper-polarized environment in the United States, you'll probably get a fair share of the population to agree with you. But it is important to note that those false claims of fraud got no traction in U.S. courts, including federal and state courts, and in decisions by both Republican and Democratic aligned judges. We have seen some action in Congress, and there's a bill that would make some changes to the process for counting electoral votes, such as making clear that the vice president has no authority to negate the result. Hopefully that bill will pass in the near future. We've also seen a lot of state level developments after 2020. I'm going to give credit for this slide and the next 2 that follows to Professor Yablon, who prepared them. According to one report that you see on the left, 33 state legislatures introduced bills that would, in one way or another, interfere with election administration. such as by giving legislators authority to review and reject election results, transferring authority from nonpartisan to partisan actors, placing new burdens and potential penalties on those who run our elections, and establishing partisan election so-called audit mechanisms, like one we saw in Arizona after 2020. We've also seen a lot of restrictions on the fundamental right to vote, with many states, particularly red states, that is, those in which Republicans dominate, adopting such measures as hurdles to voter registration, aggressive purges of voter registration lists, cutbacks to absentee and early voting, bans on drop boxes, more stringent voter identification requirements, and limits on helping voters. And here you see a map showing really the polarized picture of election laws. In a number of states, those shown in yellow on this map, yellow or orange, sorry, I'm a little colorblind, but we've actually seen the liberalization of voting laws, that is, laws making it easier to vote. These are mostly in states where Democrats dominate. In other states, the ones shown in blue, these are states where Republicans mostly dominate, the move has been towards more restrictive laws. So I mentioned at the top that most of the laws that govern our elections in the United States, including federal elections, come from the states. We are rapidly moving towards having very different election systems in states where Republicans dominate as opposed to those where Democrats dominate. Finally, we've seen a lot of election litigation in this cycle as well. I don't have final numbers. Professor Hassan hasn't yet updated his chart for this election, but we've seen a lot of lawsuits in this cycle, including a bunch of them right here in the state where we are, Wisconsin, which is very much a swing state. It is what we call a purple state, roughly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. In our most recent election, the Republican candidate, Ron Johnson, won the election for U.S. Senate, but the Democratic candidate, Tony Evers, won the election for our state's governor. So we are very much a divided state, and it's especially in states, purple states like Wisconsin, that you see the fiercest battles over the election rules, such as the battles that are noted on the right regarding a wide variety of issues, particularly having to do with absentee voting and drop boxes like the one you see on the lower left corner here in the state of Wisconsin. So I will end my presentation there and turn it over to Professor Yvonne.
Professor Tokaji, thank you very much. It was a very, very clear exposition. I think all Brazilian students are able to follow, to understand what you've explained. And so now I have the pleasure to pass the floor to Professor Yablon and to learn a bit more the US system. Professor Yablon, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm also delighted to be here. It's always difficult to follow Professor Tokaji, who provided such wonderful background. But this is such a timely conversation, given that we're at a moment where two of the world's largest democracies had important elections within weeks of one another. And so what an excellent time to think comparatively about the health of our two democratic systems. What I'm going to do is build a little bit on what Dean Tokaji was talking about in terms of our system of election administration in the US by focusing on one important aspect of election administration, which is the way that we draw electoral district lines in the US. And I'll use that as a bit of background to then talk about some of the results that we've seen over the past week in the US, the outcome of these important 2022 midterms. So like Dean Tokaji, I do have slides, and so let me share my screen with you. And so, let me say just a few words about the system of electoral districting that we have in the US. At the national or federal level, we have a bicameral legislature. The US Senate is represented by states. So each state has 2 senators, no matter their size in terms of population. So although California has 70 times as many people as Wyoming, each of them has 2 senators, and there are 100 members of the Senate. The Senate is not redistricted. The representation remains equal by state over time, and that's been true throughout the course of U.S. history. But we also have a House of Representatives where representation is through equally populated electoral districts. And those electoral district boundaries periodically get redrawn. And there's a lot of gamesmanship that happens in the drawing of those district lines that can affect the distribution of political power in the United States. And so a few words just about how this districting process works. Beginning with timing. When, how often are these district lines drawn? Our practice in the US is to redraw electoral districts every decade, every 10 years. And that's that happens after we do a national census in the United States. There was a census in 2020. The data from that census was released in 2021. And so that triggered an obligation to redraw lines both for the US House of Representatives, but also for state and local electoral districts around the country. And as part of this decennial redistricting process at the federal level, what happens is you see that state populations change, relatively speaking. Some states gain population, other states lose population. And that actually means that the number of members of Congress that each state gets might shift a little bit. And here you see that we've had a bit of a shift in the US in terms of our population distribution away from the Northeast and upper Midwest part of the country, those states in purple. They each lost 1 member of Congress, and those members of Congress were redistributed to those states in green, including Texas, which actually gained 2 seats in Congress because it picked up so many individuals over the past decade. So that's called reapportionment, redistributing the congressional seats based on population. And then you have a process of redrawing lines within states. That's the process of redistricting. And so here is just a quick example. The state of Oregon was one of those states in green. It picked up a congressional seat. It went from having 5 members of Congress to 6. On the left, you see what those districts looked like after the 2010 census. And then you see what it looks like now after the 2020 census, where there's now a 6th district. So the lines shift. And who makes those decisions? Who decides where these districts go, how the lines will change? The answer is that in most states, and this is consistent with what Dean Tokaji was saying, in most states, it is partisan actors who make the decisions about how these lines should be drawn. All of those states in green on this map have their state legislatures do the line drawing, and they vote on the new lines as they would with other legislation. The governor of the state will sign off on or veto that legislation. The states that are in whatever that color is, a sort of brownish yellow, they are states that have a more independent process, a more nonpartisan process that's insulated from politics. But as you see, that's a minority of the states in the US. So in most places, this is partisan. And again, this is decentralized. So these congressional districts, for the national legislature, the lines are being drawn in each state individually. They're making their own decisions about how their congressional districts should look. Right? And what are the criteria that they apply when they draw these lines? Well, there are a few federal rules that they need to apply. There is, for example, a requirement that these districts be about equal in population. So, Oregon had those 6 congressional districts. Each of those districts has to have about the same number of people. And that comes from the US Constitution as interpreted by the US Supreme Court. There's also a federal law requirement that those who are drawing these district lines may not discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. There is a constitutional component to that. Dean Tokaji talked briefly about the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And then part of this is also statutory. He mentioned the Federal Voting Rights Act. There is a controversy about the precise scope of these non-discrimination requirements. In fact, there's an important case right now in the US Supreme Court about exactly how these non-discrimination rules apply. But those are federal rules that each state is supposed to follow as they draw lines. But the rest of the rules that they apply come from their own state law, and they vary across the country. So these are just some examples of the kinds of rules that you might see in any given state. There are many states, the vast majority of states, do have requirements that the electoral districts have to be composed of contiguous territory. So it actually has to be, a block of land. And the districts are meant to be geographically compact rather than really strangely shaped. And different states will enforce those requirements in different ways. Many states also have requirements that, to the extent possible, those who are drawing the district lines should try to respect local government boundaries, and so not unnecessarily split cities or counties or what are known as communities of interest. Those might be groups of people that may cross a local government boundary, but who share economic interests, for example. There would be a preference to put those individuals in the same districts to the extent possible. Again, the extent to which those rules are enforced and how they're enforced may vary from state to state. There are a smaller number of states that have requirements that the districting process should essentially be nonpartisan in its intent or effect, that the lines should be drawn to avoid favoring a particular political party or incumbent office holders. But those rules actually exist in only a minority of the states, mostly in those states that have a process that takes the line drawing away from the legislature. In most of the states where the legislature draws these district lines, they do not have formally these limits on being able to draw lines to advantage themselves, right? And that gets us to the problem of gerrymandering in the United States, right? Gerrymandering is essentially the practice of drawing these district lines to give one political party an outsized advantage. And so if you control the line drawing process, usually you can be strategic about how you do this in order to give your side a disproportionate number of the electoral seats. And this is a persistent problem in US elections. And you see here that as the 2020 census results came in and the redistricting process got underway, there was a surge in gerrymandering activity in states that were controlled by Democrats and in states that were controlled by Republicans. And here you see an illustration of that helps explain why gerrymandering has become an actually more difficult problem in recent years. And that is, there are more states that have unified party government than was true in, say, 1990 or 2000. There are 23 states that as of 2021 had unified Republican control, 15 states that had unified Democratic control. And when it's one party that really controls the districting process, there are more opportunities for them to tilt the playing field in their favor. And you see there were only 12 states that have divided government where it's more difficult to play these line drawing games. Now, how does gerrymandering work? Well, here's one illustration that helps show it. Imagine that you have a jurisdiction where 60% of voters are part of the blue team, 40% are part of the yellow team. It is possible to draw those district lines to give members of the blue team majorities in all 5 of those districts, so disproportionate representation. It also is possible, with a little bit of creativity, to give the yellow team 3 of those 5 districts, even though they're only 40% of the jurisdiction's population. And you see that illustrated right here, right? So when we're talking about gerrymandering, we're talking in large part about creating these disproportionate outcomes instead of more proportionate outcomes where at the district level, you get representation that's closer to the jurisdiction-wide breakdown. Now, this is congressional districting across the country, a graphic from 538.com. And it shows you that one consequence of gerrymandering tends to be that you have fewer districts that you otherwise might, where there's actually political competition. The people who are drawing the lines are trying to draw fairly safe districts for their party. And at the same time, they're often packing voters from the other party into as few districts as possible. And so what's illustrated here is that among the 435 congressional districts in the US, only about 10% of them would be considered highly competitive districts. Now, you're never going to have 435 competitive districts because partisans distribute among communities in different ways. But if you actually prioritized political competition, you would end up with many more competitive districts than we have right now. So that's a little bit of background on how our redistricting system works, how gerrymandering works in our country. Here's one further illustration from our state of Wisconsin. As Dean Tokaji indicated, Wisconsin is a swing state in the US. It's a state where a majority voted for President Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, narrowly voted for President Trump in 2016, and then narrowly voted for Joe Biden in 2020. In 2022, we elected a Democratic governor, but also a Republican US senator. So we have 8 congressional districts in Wisconsin. You might think that Wisconsin, therefore, ought to have about a 4-4 distribution of congressional districts. But that's not how it has worked out. We instead have 2 districts around the cities of Madison and Milwaukee, where most of the Democratic voters have been packed in. And then the lines have been somewhat strategically drawn to allow Republicans to prevail in 3/4 of our congressional districts, 6 of those 8 districts. The same is true with our state legislature. So although we elected a Democratic governor last week, our state legislature is nearly 2/3 Republican, because the Republicans in the state were the map is a map of their creation, and they were very strategic about trying to maximize their advantage. So, as I'm starting now to get into the results of the 22 election, let me zoom out a little bit and talk about what we expected to see and what we have seen in the US. It is typical in US elections at the midterms. So, we're at the midpoint of President Biden's term, and at the midterm, you have all of the members of the House of Representatives up for re-election. They serve 2-year terms, and you have 1/3 of the members of the U.S. Senate who are up for re-election, and you have many state governors and state legislators who are also up for re-election. Most commonly at these midterms, the president's party does poorly. And so here you see that historically. So almost every time, the president's party loses seats in the US House of Representatives, and sometimes loses dozens of seats in the House of Representatives. Often, not quite as often, but very often, the president's party also loses seats in the US Senate. And political scientists could go into detail about the reasons why this happens. But the expectations were based on this history that the Democrats would probably lose ground during these 2022 midterms, especially because of a couple of other factors. One is that President Biden's approval rating right now is not very high. His approval rating is under 50%. And more than that, Americans right now are fairly pessimistic about the state of our economy, in particular because we have fairly high inflation in the US right now. And when the economy is perceived to not be very strong, those are instances in which the president's party has tended to do especially poorly. So those were some of the expectations going into the 2022 midterms. The Democrats largely defied those expectations and did better than expected. So when it comes to the US Senate, our Senate going into the 2022 midterms was exactly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats controlled the Senate because under our rules, the vice president, Kamala Harris, gets to cast the deciding vote in case of a tie. So we had a 50-50 balance, but the Democrats controlled it. Coming out of the election, the Democrats are going to retain at least 50 seats. They may end up with 51. There's a runoff election that will happen in Georgia in December. But the Democrats have at least maintained their position and might improve it. In every state, the Democrats held on to the seats that they previously controlled. And in one state, Pennsylvania, they picked up a seat that was previously controlled by the Republicans. Now, in the House of Representatives, the Democrats have lost a little bit of ground, but only a little. So by historical standards, they have done better than you would have expected. The Democrats had a narrow majority in the U.S. House before the 2022 election. It now looks like the Republicans will have a very narrow majority. There are still about 9 or 10 seats that have not yet been formally called, but the Republicans are highly likely to have a majority of a few seats when all is said and done. Now, that is an important shift. It means that the Democrats will not be able to pass legislation in the same way that they were able to for the past couple of years. It means that there may be some investigations of President Biden led by the House of Representatives that otherwise wouldn't have taken place. But because the balance of power will be narrow, the Republicans might not be able to do as much as they would have if they had a stronger majority in the House of Representatives. At the state level, the Democrats also did quite well. The Democrats picked up governorships in 2 states. They picked up governorships in the states of Massachusetts and Maryland and in Arizona, and they only lost 1 governorship in the state of Nevada. And when on the right, you see state government trifectas. These are the states that were fully controlled by one party or the other. You see that going into the election, the Republicans fully controlled the governorship and the state legislatures in 23 states, the Democrats in 14 states. After the 2022 midterms, it looks like the Republicans will fully control 1 fewer state government, and the Democrats have picked up control in 3 more states. So the last thing I'll say is, not only did the Democrats outperform expectations in 2022, but it's also significant to think about exactly who won and who lost. And the candidates that seemed to fare especially poorly, particularly in swing states like Wisconsin or Arizona or Pennsylvania, were the candidates that were most closely aligned with President Trump and with the kind of election denialism that Dean Tokaji was talking about earlier. In many states, you had candidates that had been endorsed by President Trump, candidates who expressed doubt about the integrity of the 2020 elections, who indicated that they might not have certified the election results in 2020 had they been in power, and suggested that they might not certify the election results in 2024. And these sometimes were candidates that were interested in trying to shift election rules in ways that would have created some problems for the integrity of the 2024 election. Most of these candidates, particularly in swing states, lost their re-election bids. You also see on the right side of the screen there the candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives that were most closely associated with President Trump. I don't know exactly how visible this is on the screen, but these are candidates that he endorsed who expressed some doubts about the 2020 election. And you see that by and large, they fared worse than you would have expected. So although there are many Republicans that continue to have doubts about the integrity of the 2020 election, there are also a fair number of Republicans and a lot of independent voters in the United States who in 2022 really rejected the narrative, the false narrative of a stolen 2020 election, and indicated that they don't want these election denialists to take power. And so one takeaway from the 2022 midterms, a relatively optimistic takeaway, and this is some commentary from a number of different outlets here, that democracy fared fairly well in 2022 in the United States. You have Dean Tokaji's co-author, Rick Hasson, talking about how he has previously been far more worried about American democracy than he was now. His view is that democracy had a strong showing in 2022 and that we're now in a stronger position heading into 2024 than we were before. There's a very prominent former federal judge named Michael Luttig, who was an advisor to Mike Pence in 2020, an informal advisor, as Vice President Mike Pence was deciding not to go along with President Trump's efforts to meddle in the electoral vote count. And he too views the outcome in 2020, the losses by so many of these election denialists, as a victory for American democracy. Now, that is not to say that we don't face challenges ahead. There are still plenty of individuals in power in the US who continue to stick to the narrative that the 2020 election was stolen and who may continue to engage in questionable conduct as we move forward in 2024. There are still some issues that we might encounter in 2022. Election results have still not been formally certified in many states. And you may see some controversies over the next month as that certification process goes forward. But coming out of the 2022 midterms, it appears that by and large, there has been a rejection of the narrative that you've heard from President Trump and some of his allies, even though, as you probably saw, that narrative is not going away. President Trump announced his candidacy already for 2024, but he will have fewer of his loyalists in positions where they can do his bidding approaching 2024. And so I will go ahead and leave things there for now. Thank you very much.
Professor Yablon, thank you very much. It was very clear, very didactic, and I think we can follow, and we are relieved and we are glad to share this democracy prospect in the United States. And so now I have the pleasure to pass the floor to my colleague, Eneida Desirée Salgado, and she, with her experience, I think she will do a very good comment here. So, Eneida Salgado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Maria Paula. It's a pleasure to be here to learn about US elections once more. We have a lot of things to worry about, but I'm very optimistic after this presentation. So thank you very much, Professor Tokaji and Professor Yablon. So I'm going to use this space to share with you some thoughts and some problems we have in common, although our systems is so different. I'm thinking about the electoral authorities. When I was in USA, I was very frightened about the number of electoral authorities. And you mentioned now 150 authorities in Wisconsin. In Brazil, we have one, a concentrated almighty electoral authority. They can do all. They do the administration of the elections. They do the adjudication of the elections because they are in the judicial branch. And sometimes they all do some rulemaking. They build some rules to the electoral administration and also to parties, to electors and voters and things like this. We don't have a very strong federalism. I may mention that we use the word federalist to a republic much more as, I think, to the past, an homage to the past, because we don't have that. We don't have different electoral systems. We don't have different civil codes or criminal codes, nothing like that. During our 5 years in the Faculty of Law, we don't study almost nothing of state laws or state constitutions or nothing like that. So this electoral authority is almighty, and also it shares three members with the Supreme Court. So we have some kind of blindage. They can do all because the Supreme Court will normally be with them in their decisions. So we have this problem here with this highly concentrated electoral authority that decided years ago about the electronic system, and now we are seeing what is happening with all this asking problems, and our president also doesn't want to concede the same problems you have here, you have there. And we also have a different electoral system. We don't use this majority system, all this problem with gerrymandering and districting, but we have this proportional representation. I like the idea theoretically about the proportional representation because of the representation of minorities. But we have a lot of political parties, a lot indeed. And we are talking about 30 political parties. Now a number a little lower about the number of effective parties. But you're talking about 12, 13 parties in the parliament, in the both houses. And we also we don't have midterms, and we have 2 terms of the election race for presidents, because we need the majority, not only the plurality. So we have in the first week of October, we had the first term, the first turnout of the presidential race, and also the parliamentary elections. And the group of the present president got a lot of seats. It will run the House and the Senate. But because of the second term, we have another president next year with a different political group. So we don't know if we're going to have a gridlock or if they're going to have a very weak opposition, how the president will co-opt these other forces and everything like this. Although I want also to have a word about Mexico. We are seeing a lot of demonstration against the electoral authority there. And they have a split electoral authority, the judicial authority and the administrative authority. And they have the same problems. They have a mixed electoral system with proportional representation and also districts, and the same problem, democracy decay, electoral denialism, and everything like this. So I'm asking you, what can we do? What can we do about that? How law schools or law scholars can help with that, to fight against electoral denialism, how to strengthen democracy, how to design the system to prevent this kind of thing. I'm not sure that's the problem of electoral system or electoral authority. I'm not sure it's about political culture, because I think that our countries are very different in this matter. And also the Mexican people are very different from us and from you. So what can we do about that? Can we have to make efforts to build a better political elite, or we have to put our efforts in political education, or we have to end this kind of political arena where we don't share the same facts? We have to know how to do that without the political discussions on social media, because this is a very difficult problem to me right now. I don't know what people think about things because they don't have the same facts. We don't know what's true. So I'm really want to know, how can we make our democracy great again to doing something through law schools, through law education, and acting with the legislatures. So please help us. Like as Professor Yablon said, democracy is rising up again in US. So how can we do that in Brazil? Thank you very much for the opportunity, Professor.
Thank you, Desirée, and thank you very much. I'll pass I want to make some questions, but let us hear from you about Professor Salgado's questions, and then I make my own. So please, Professor Tokaji.
Thank you so much. Professor Salgado, I want to thank you so much for such a rich set of remarks. Let me start by talking about some of the differences you mentioned between our system and yours. We are extraordinarily decentralized in the dispersal of authority in the United States. And there is no doubt that creates some problems. We don't have a strong national authority. We do have a couple of federal agencies that have some limited responsibilities, but they're really quite limited, and they do not run elections in the way that the national authority in Mexico, in Brazil, and many other countries does. That definitely creates some problems of consistency and uniformity. I will say, however, over time, I've come to see that an advantage of the system is that it makes it more resistant to capture, right? Imagine if in 2020, at the time that election was being conducted, President Trump had held authority over how elections were run in all of the 50 states. So I do think that while there are certainly a lot of costs to our exceptionally decentralized system, there are some benefits as well. You make a really nice point about the important differences between the kind of districted elections that we have, where most of the time it's what we tend to call first past the post elections, two candidates running for election in a particular district, the candidate with the most votes winning, and proportional representation systems like you have, like many other democratic countries, including in Europe, have. I think there are pros and cons to each of those as well. We're kind of stuck with what we have, I'm afraid, here in the United States, whether you like it or not. A really strong two-party system which results, political scientists will tell you, from the fact of we have a first past the post system, which, for better or worse, people seem pretty tied to, and a national presidential election, which has given us this really strong two-party system throughout our history. But what's really interesting is, while we've always had a strong two-party system, we have not always had the high degree of political polarization, including really extremism, most notable on the right, although sometimes evident on the left as well, that we see now in the United States. And then a third really important difference, the role that courts play in democracy. We see our court playing a really important role on all sorts of issues, the US Supreme Court, that is, from abortion to guns to marriage to property rights to race-conscious affirmative action. And it's been quite active in the electoral sphere as well, I think often in a not very constructive way in recent years. What can we do to strengthen democracy? This is your big question. And I do want to start by noting that for all the differences between our systems and between the US system, the Brazilian system, and systems all over the countries, we are seeing a common set of problems in lots of different countries right now. We are seeing the rise of anti-democratic parties, the rise of authoritarianism in lots of different places. And so you have to believe that this common problem that is going on really in democracies, including established democracies all over the world, it has more to do with the way than how we run our elections, because we run them so differently in the respects I've mentioned and in others. So I have a pretty strong view of what's causing this. I think it is the rise of economic inequality within our countries, the lack of social mobility. If you look in the United States, for example, you will see that over the past 40 years, political polarization and the rise of extremism, including anti-small d democratic extremism, has increased, almost in tandem with economic inequality, which has also risen dramatically in these years. And this is, the United States is particularly dramatic, both in the rise of economic inequality and in the rise of polarization. I think that's what accounts for the especially serious problems that we're seeing in the United States right now. But we are certainly not unique in that respect. And I tend to believe that the problems that democracies are facing across the world right now really require us to get our arms around this huge problem of economic inequality and lack of social mobility, which tends to leave people very frustrated, even angry, in ways that make them susceptible to misinformation, to anti-democratic appeals, and to the sort of racist appeals that we've seen in the United States and in many other countries, including Brazil.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Yablon.
I don't have a whole lot to add. That was a very thorough answer, and I agree with almost everything that Dean Tokaji said. I'll just mention a couple of things. I think that Dean Tokaji is right that, given that we're seeing these challenges to democracy across the world in systems that have very different institutional contexts, it's hard to pin it all on the particular failings of institutions, and there are bigger forces at work. That said, there might be institutional changes and reforms that could help nudge us in the right direction. And so in the US, for example, our democracy would probably be strengthened if we continued to move or did more to move from partisan to nonpartisan election administration. Including when it comes to redistricting, moving more states to models where nonpartisan actors draw the lines, for election administration, moving from partisan secretaries of state to more politically insulated bodies. That would take a little bit of the pressure off of the system. There are also institutional reforms that are being experimented with. And again, one of the virtues of decentralization in the US is that there is some of this room for experimentation. You have a small but growing number of states that are moving, for example, to systems of ranked choice voting, where at the general election stage, one model is that you end up with 4 finalists on the ballot. They can be from either political party, and voters rank those candidates in order 1 to 4. And that kind of system tends to favor more moderate candidates. The candidates that may have strong support from a plurality but are really opposed by a majority end up getting some 1s, but then a lot of 4s, and they don't fare as well when you tally up the votes. And so if more states move to that kind of a system, it again may nudge us away from some of the strong anti-democratic rhetoric that we've been hearing. The last thing I'd say is in the US, and I don't know as much about the Brazilian situation, but my impression is that maybe this is similar. When democracy actually becomes an important election issue, democracy often prevails. Because in the US, I think it's true, and I think this is true in many other places, democracy is popular. And if the people are presented with a choice between democratic and anti-democratic forces, they will more often than not, I think, their better instincts will prevail, and they'll choose those democratic forces. And so what we saw in the 2022 midterms to some extent, I think, was a healthy course correction where the choice was starkly put in at least some races to people, do you want an election denier running your election? And for the most part, the people in the US answered no to that question.
Thank you very much. Desirée, do you want to make any remark?
Just one. I'm not sure if in Brazil the support for democracy is majority right now, because we have some numbers of Latino barometer that seems that we don't have this kind of defense so strong. And we have right now a lot of people in front of headquarters asking for a military coup. So it's very hard to explain our system to you, because although we have elections and a very good electronic system, I think, voting electronic system, we have this kind of thing. So people using the freedom of speech to ask for the end of freedom of speech and the political freedoms to the end of political freedom. So I hope you are right, Professor Yablon, and that in a fight between anti-democratic and democratic parties, we have the prevail of the Democratic Party. But I'm not sure about that, maybe because it's a very bad moment right now here. The president didn't concede yet. He said he won't accept the results of the election. So it's our almost January 6th, but I hope we don't get there because the certification is immediate here. So in the day of the election, we have already had the results, but we have this problem with people crying, using the uniform of the soccer team to protest, to manifest, and everything like this. But I will hope you're right, and I'm only seeing the empty glass right now.
Thank you, Professor Desirée Salgado. I would like to make two questions to our guests, to our experts. And one of them is a simple question. Is, as Professor Salgado said, the electronic, the voting machine, the ballot machine is a national pride in Brazil. It was our narrative against elections was directed through the ballot machine. And we are very proud of this certification of the results almost 3 hours after the election. But we must remember that we don't have in Brazil the mailing vote. Is it really an advantage? I am surprised with the numbers you've brought. Almost 46% of the voters vote by mail. We never had this, nothing similar in Brazil. And what are the prospects of the mail voting? Will it last after the pandemic? Because 2020 was the pandemic year. Do you think it will last? And my second question is a bit more elaborated. Is something dealing with the identitarian questions, because we have always experienced the identitarian questions as something against the general principles of democracy. Democracy is, first of all, a question of universal issues. And there was a critic against women issues and racial issues, since they are kind of minority. They are not minority, because in Brazil, the Black people is almost half the population of the country, different from you. In the US, I think you have, once I've heard, 13% of the population is Black population. In Brazil, it's 50-50. And the women's, similar proportion. So can we say these identitarian issues saved democracy, US democracy, since, yeah, it's a kind of caricature, since the abortion seemed to have had a very important role in this election? Can we say, and most the threat of the voting rights were focused on Black people? So can we say Black people fighting against this limitation, and women fighting against the limitation on abortion rights, which were part of the election in some states? Can we say these minorities saved the universal sense of democracy? These were my remarks. Thank you. So,
maybe maybe I'll take, if it's okay with Professor Yablon, the question about mail voting and defer the question about identity, which is a great one, but I'm not sure I have a great answer to it to him if he wants to take it. So on mail voting, we've actually seen this over a period of decades, more and more people voting by mail and through other remote means, such as early voting before the election. That's been increasing steadily for decades. We saw a dramatic increase in the 2020 election because of the conditions that prevailed at that time. But I do think that mail voting and other forms of remote voting, like in-person early voting, are here to stay in the United States. I actually have long been an admirer, going back to the early aughts, when I was writing about issues of voting technology and the transformation that we were undertaking here in the United States, of Brazil's system. There has been for many years a controversy over electronic voting machines in the United States, and I started my career as a big advocate of making a transition away from punch cards towards electronic voting systems, which we still have in many parts of the United States. I don't think we need to delve too much into that controversy, other than to observe that we have a mix of systems in the United States. But I do think the trend towards more mail voting, whether one likes it or not, it's here to stay in the United States. We may not always have the same high level that we had in 2020, but I do think that it's here to stay. And I guess I'll say that while there are pros and cons, I don't see it as being a terrible thing. I actually think I tend to favor increasing opportunities to vote, which can both drive up turnout and the representativeness of the electorate if you provide multiple ways in which people can vote.
Thank you very much, Professor Yablon.
So first on vote by mail, I agree with Dean Tokaji. We are going to continue to see variation by state. There are some states that have moved to all mail voting, and there probably will be a few more that do that. There are other states that are really resisting that. Something else that I hope we'll see is that in those states that are moving to mail voting, that we continue to improve the process of counting those votes in a timely way. There's been controversy in some states, for example, about whether you should be allowed to begin the counting or processing of those votes before Election Day. In states that allow that, you're going to get more timely results than in states where the election officials aren't allowed to do anything with those mail ballots until Election Day or after. So, this is going to be an ongoing issue, but I think the trend will continue to be, in a vote by mail direction. The second question is a great and challenging question. They're at a theoretical level. There are questions about the nature of democracy, and if you are a pluralist who imagines that democracy is really about group politics and groups finding alliances and trying to build majorities, then one way to interpret that, what we saw in 2022, is a healthy pluralist system where you have very motivated groups of voters, women, for example, who were really appalled by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Generally lining up behind the Democratic candidates who tended to be more favorably inclined to reproductive rights. And then similarly, for a long time now, the African-American community has tended to support the Democratic Party in very large numbers, and many members of that community are skeptical of the Republican Party's efforts to do things like make it harder to vote. And they understand that historically, they have been a group that's been disproportionately affected by some of those disenfranchisement kind of efforts. And so, you could view those groups as groups that really going into this election saw that their rights were directly at stake. They had experienced some losses, some defeats, and they rallied together with others as well. And so, you know, I don't know that I can offer you much more than that, but at least that's one interpretation. It's absolutely the case, I think, that the Democrats ended up being benefited by the fact that abortion rights became a very prominent issue, and in some ways a distraction from some of the economic issues that might otherwise have gotten more attention and maybe not been as favorable for them.
Maybe I'll add one thing on that point. I think Professor Yablon is exactly right. And, you know, it'll be a while before political scientists have a chance to really crunch the data and figure out why this election was quite different from the usual pattern we see in midterm elections, where the president's party usually fares very poorly in midterm elections. Democrats did much better than expected. But not in every state. And this is really interesting. You look, there are a lot of state variations. For example, in Michigan, the state immediately to our east across Lake Michigan here in the US Midwest, in Michigan, Democrats did exceptionally well. And this is a pretty purple state. In New York, by contrast, the state of New York, Democrats did very poorly. The most plausible explanation I've heard for this so far is that there are two things that really account for this. That in states where either abortion or democracy were on the ballot, Democrats did really well. So where you had election deniers running for office, a position that is that many Americans subscribe to, but certainly not a majority, thankfully. Boy, Democrats really did very well, and these tend to be candidates who are closely aligned with President Trump. And in states where there are real threats to abortion rights, like Michigan, but not New York, not California, Democrats did very well. And so I think those are surely not the only explanations, but as we stand right now, just a week after the election, those to me look like the biggest factors in explaining why Democrats on the whole did better, at least in many states, than is usually the case in midterms.
Thank you very much, Dean Tokeji. Well, I think we can come to the closing of our meeting. It was wonderful. I think we Brazilians we're going to profit very much from this clear explanation and this opportunity of comparing some of the aspects of our systems. And I finished this by thank you once more, Dean Tokeji, Professor Robert Yablon, and Professor Eneida Desirée Salgado. It was a very profitable morning and very nice discussion. I don't know if you want to say some words, and we can close after. Professor Tokeji, we can.
All I have to say is thank you for this great opportunity, and I hope we have a chance to do it in person sometime.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yablon.
Likewise, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Professor Eneida.
Thank you for having me here to listen about it, learning about it, and being a little bit more optimistic than before. So thank you very much for this kind of sensation right now. Thank you very much, professors.
Okay, so thank you very much, professors. I hope we are going to see our medicine, I expect to bring you here in live to Brazil. See you. Bye.